Welcome to WitchLit, a place to talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Raschke, author, publisher, witch, and nosy Scorpio. You can support WitchLit and the serious book habit it requires at ko-fi.com/WitchLitPodcast. And you can be part of the show by sending in your own death, sex, religion, politics, money questions for our guests to victoria@witchlitpod.com. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and give us a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. It really does help other witches find the show. Here's to never getting to the bottom of our to-be-read piles. Phoenix LaFae is a professional reader, root worker, teacher, and ritualist. She has been practicing witchcraft for almost 30 years. She weaves a tapestry of traditions, including eclectic witchcraft, Wicca, Druidry, and more. She is the owner of an esoteric goddess shop called Milk and Honey, and she is the author of several books, including What is Remembered Lives, Walking in Beauty, Witches, Heretics, and Warrior Women, Life Ritualized, co-authored with Gwion Raven, and her newest book, A Witch's Guide to Creating and Performing Rituals That Actually Work. Phoenix LaFae, welcome to WitchLit.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on and excited to talk writing and books with you. I'm ready to go. So our first question for everybody on the show is, why write in this time of social media and videos and all of that stuff? Why still write books?
Yeah, that's a really lovely question. As a kid, like at maybe 12, 11, I read my first Stephen King book. And I was like, this is what I'm going to do. And I read a lot of Danielle Steele as a kid too. I'm not afraid to admit it. I wrote like a romance story when I was 13, it's not a novel, obviously. I was 13 and I had to write it on notepads because we didn't have a computer. But it's like in my blood. It's always been who I am. I have fantasy novels written. They're just like secrets that I don't talk about or share with anybody. But witchcraft, like next to writing, witchcraft and the practices of witchcraft is my passion. So it just makes sense. Like I love writing. I love expressing in that way. And I really can't talk about anything except witchcraft. So it just makes sense to put those two things together.
I am surprised how many nonfiction authors I've talked to on the show who have a secret fiction writing practice.
It's not that uncommon, really. Yeah. Someday there'll be a TV series based off of my fantasy novel. Sure, why not?
There you go. I mean, why not? I mean, they're making them out of everything else.
That's right.
Should be what it appears. So how did you go from writing being your passion and wanting to do that to actually getting your first book published? Like, what was that journey like?
Yeah. So I worked in the corporate world for a really long time. And that is like when you have boring corporate jobs and you can kind of squeeze in like, it's slow today. I'll work a little chapter on my novel and play with that. And then that ended. And that's a long story about how it ended, but it was the economy changed, layoffs, blah, blah. And so I started exploring different avenues. And one of the avenues was freelance writing. I had a really good friend who was a freelance writer, and she sort of showed me how to get into that world. And I liked it, but I also hated it because it was like, write 10 articles about snowblowers. And, it felt like I was in school again. And I realized, that's why I hated that part of my education, was because I had no creativity. I was forced to write about this thing that I might not actually care about, right? So then I started working at a metaphysical shop. I worked at Lucky Mojo, who folks may be familiar with or not, but the owner of Lucky Mojo publishes books. That's part of what she does. That's part of her work in the world. And she knew that I was a freelance writer and that I had decades of experience with magic and spell writing and witchcraft. And so we collaborated on a book together. And that was my first book. It kind of just magically happened. Getting hired at Lucky Mojo was a magical process. So that was the first book that was ever published. And it was about creating altars. Mm-hmm. And then it just kind of kept going. I went to PantheaCon. You know, there used to be a big witchcraft festival here in San Jose in California, and Llewellyn Publishers always had a open house where you could come and pitch. And so I took a shot and I went to the hospitality suite and I pitched my idea for What Is Remembered Lives, and they liked it. And that was it. Now I put in a new proposal every year practically, and I just keep going.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, obviously I've interviewed a lot of Llewellyn authors on the show just because Llewellyn is one of the big, publishers of witchcraft and cult books. But it seems like there is like this pipeline of Llewellyn authors that either they met one of the editors or they've done something at like PantheaCon or.
Right. I mean, and it's scary. Like going to a pitch session is really scary. And I'm good friends with Jason Minke, who's a Llewellyn author, and he was very encouraging. I really can't express enough gratitude for Jason's support of me writing. And he was like, they're going to love you. You can do it. And, like I said, I took a shot because I needed some liquid courage. But it's scary. It's scary to go and put your heart on the table for someone else to judge, because most of my books are very, very personal. And it is scary to be like, here's a part of me. Go ahead and rip it to shreds.
Yeah. I mean, it's like putting your child out in the world,
Exactly.
It is that way, I think. And, I mean, one of the things, and I like, I recently had read, Witches, Heretics, and Warrior Women when it came out. And so I reread it this week, waiting on your other book to come, which we had a whole story before that readers don't get to hear about the book not showing up. But I love in the beginning, you say like, a lot of people find my writing cheeky. Yeah. And I was like, cheeky is probably not the word I would use. I mean, I agree, but I think it's more just like this very conversational tone.
Yeah.
And so it does feel like you're just sitting down with someone and saying, okay, this is how I see these things. Like it doesn't feel overly florid or anything like that. It's just like very simple. Like, this is what I see it. This is how I do it. And it's just very easy to read. And you kind of feel like you're just chatting with a friend kind of thing, which I always like that approach to kind of esoteric stuff, because it's very easy, I think, to fall in the trap of, I have to make this sound academic and important.
Right. Yeah.
When it's really something that is people's everyday practice. Right. So, I appreciate that about your work.
Thank you. It's really lovely to hear that, actually, especially with the Heretics book. I teach a lot. So I really wanted the voice to come across as if I was teaching a class and how I teach, which is very conversational. Mm-hmm. So that was definitely my goal. So I'm glad that at least you picked up on that. Yay.
No, it's great. And I enjoy the writing of that book, because I just like the approach to like, here. And I also, one of the things that I really like about it is you do not shy away from sharing stories of women who we think of as more as Christian or kind of mainstream folks. Yeah. And I think that's important because, I do think a lot of people in the witchcraft and occult community have damage from their time in mainstream religion. Let's just put it that way. And so they don't want to engage with that. And I totally respect that. But a lot of us grew up in that soup, whether we were, actually practiced or not. And I think it's difficult to just say, I'm going to cut this whole part of my culture out of my life. So I enjoyed that part of it too.
Yeah. And, if you look at there's 9 women that I outline in Witches, Heretics book, and a lot of them, we could look at what they did and their practices and go, oh yeah, that looks like witchcraft, but they didn't look at their practices like that. And in many cases would have been offended to have been called a witch, right? Like the culture has changed, and now we wear witch as like a badge of honor. And I know at least when I first started practicing, I wanted people to be freaked out. Right. I was 15 and I wanted people to go, oh my God, witchcraft, shocking, and I'm kind of over that mostly. Now that I'm 45, I'm mostly over that. But, Joan of Arc was not a witch. She was a devout Catholic, but a lot of what she did looks like witchcraft.
Yeah.
So I think it's important too to look at that. Like, witchcraft isn't one thing,
Yeah. And I think, even in Christianity, she would be considered a mystic.
Totally.
But modern Christianity, especially as practiced in the United States, doesn't really have a lot of room for mystics.
No.
So,
sad.
It's sad because I mean, those are the people I find most interesting.
Exactly. Me too.
Hildegard von Bingen is probably one of my main Christian mystics that I just like. Her artwork just speaks to me on a level I don't really understand yet.
Yeah. Yeah, she's another badass for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So kind of, I guess, more on the like writer life part. Like, I noticed on your website that writer is the first thing on your. So do you feel that way, that you're a writer first and then like the witchcraft and all that comes second? Or do you feel like you're a witch first who also writes?
Wow. I don't know. I think they are like really close. Like so close that I don't know I could differentiate one being higher in the rankings than another. I think that I fell in love with writing and reading way before witchcraft was on my radar. So I could say that that's my first love, and then witchcraft came along and expanded that. Yeah.
That makes sense. I mean, I feel like they're layered for me too. It took me a long time to figure them out.
Yeah.
I kind of had this like compartmentalization in my brain about, my writing is one thing and witchcraft is one thing. It's like, but you're writing about witches. Is it really different?
Right. Yeah. I'm an excellent compartmentalizer, but I've just thrown that all out the window. Like everything I do, especially like running a retail business, that's a witchcraft business. Everything in my world is witchcraft.
Yeah.
I just have to accept it and be okay with it.
Yeah. So how do you balance that with I grew up with parents who ran a business. So I know that is like a full-time, even more than full-time life. Yeah. So how do you find time to write and be a witch and also be a business person?
Yeah, I have like 4 full-time jobs. I don't really know, honestly, how I do it. I joke that my Mercury is in Aries, and so I just move very fast and communicate very fast. I do things very fast. I kind of thrive in chaos a little bit. Like I need to have, for example, my partner and I, Guion, we wrote Life Ritualized together. And that was a huge challenge because we are polar opposites in the writing process. I'll have like the TV on in the background and I have spreadsheets up and I'm writing and I'm doing all of these things at the same time. And he needs like complete silence and the house to be clean and the dog to be napping and the stars to align. He needs this very austere environment and I need a chaotic environment. So I think that is, plus I have ADHD. So I think that's also part of it. Like being able to jump from one thing to another is what keeps me engaged, I guess. It's organized chaos. Yeah.
So basically, you've poured those 4 full-time jobs into one Phoenix life kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
That makes sense. I do think, I don't know. And again, like my end for this is people I've had on the show and talked to about this, but it does seem like there is a big overlap in the Venn diagram of people who are neurodivergent in some way and people who are into witchcraft and the occult.
Yeah, I agree with that. I used to joke, my mom is, her church is religious science. So they're very woo. They're very, like, she would show me how they would pray. They'd go through their prayer process. And I was like, that's a spell. Like, that's just doing spells. But we would joke that her religion and her church called a lot of odd people. And I was like, yeah, so does witchcraft. We call a lot of odd people. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true. I know a lot of people on the spectrum, neurodivergent folks. It's because I think as witches and spiritual practitioners in general, we're willing to look at the world differently than the mainstream. And so there's space for that in our communities.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I don't know that the Venn diagram overlap is the same with writers, but I do know a lot of writers who are ADHD or on the spectrum as well, or like subclinical on those scales.
Right.
They're also writers. So yeah, I think I do think it's a perspective thing. I think you're right.
Totally.
Like it just shifts the lens, like in a way that how you think about things and look at the world.
Yeah. Yeah, the message from our overculture, or the dominant paradigm, or however you want to look at it, doesn't fit for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
But so many people are comfortable. Even, if you think of like the way the world works is like an itchy sweater, some people are fine with the itchy sweater. And some of us are like, oh my God, take this itchy sweater off of me before I go crazy. And I think we're just more unwilling to sit with the discomfort, and we want to do something different and change it. And that's my whole desire. I joke when I talk about the Witches and Heretics book that I'm trying to turn everyone into a heretic.
Yeah, there is I don't know, there's a draw to being a heretic or an iconoclast, or there's just like that. There is a little bit of bravery in it, but I think sometimes it's not even bravery. It's just like being true to yourself.
Absolutely.
It's not necessarily brave. It's just like you kind of have to, like you said, with the itchy sweater.
Yeah. Yeah, but you know what? Even that, there is some level of bravery required to just be different. Like that's historically for humans, being different was not cool. It was dangerous, and culturally, at least where we are in the United States, and especially where I am in Northern California, where I have this sweet little bubble to be a weirdo and be safe with that. But it is a lot easier to say, no, actually, that's not cool, or no, I don't want to go along with that, or no, I'm different and this is how it is. And you just need to be accepting. And we're moving more and more in that direction culturally. And that makes me really excited.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I do think, I know a lot of people kind of look down on like the kind of social media boom in witchcraft is kind of this aesthetic trendy thing. But I think you're right. I think it speaks to something deeper that's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've got my, cranky old lady vibes about social media. I do. Sometimes I just got to roll my eyes and be annoyed. But I figure any way in is a way in, like however long ago Thor came out, I was like, watch. Interest in heathenry is going to spike because of this Marvel comic book movie. And it did. It totally did. Whatever your gateway drug is, wonderful. If this is how you find, if the aesthetic woo witchcraft stuff on Instagram is how you find your spiritual path, awesome. Yeah. I do still have my get off my lawn moments, but mostly I feel good about it.
Yeah. I think it is easy for those of us who are Gen Xers or elder millennials to go, oh, social media, when we're like, oh, yeah, there was Anne Rice and the craft and,
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
We had our own cultural on-ramp. It just wasn't social media.
Yeah, the 90s was a peak in all of that in the movement. And, we forget.
Yeah, that's part of why it's easy to say, get off my lawn, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
That you used to be the person stomping on the grass.
Yep.
So, yeah. So I want to talk about your new book, even though, like I said, I haven't got a chance to look at it. But I do think from what I have read and the kind of the press stuff about it, that it does feed off life ritualized. Like it seems to me that those are connected for you. So do you want to talk about kind of that book and then the new book and how those like that progress?
Yeah. So Gwen and I wrote a book about rites of passage, right? So we have these huge transitional moments in our lives. And again, culturally, we don't really get a lot of time and space to honor those transitions. We have weddings, we have baby showers, there's graduations, but we don't really make a lot of space for what that does to us as spiritual beings. And there are these huge things that happen, and we're always in a rites of passage moment. It's just we might not see what we're in when we're in it. So we wrote a book about how to tap into that. And we share a bunch of rituals all about the loss of a pet, to a wedding, to a baby shower, to your kid graduating high school, to getting your driver's license, like all of the things, the big moments and the little moments, and how to create ritual for those things to honor our life transitions. So, that book was really focused on the big rites of passage. And then I realized we wrote a ton of rituals for that book. And my opinion is those are jumping off points. Read the ritual and then change it and make it your own. But I know I've met a lot of people who are like, well, how do you make a ritual? How do you do a ritual? What are the steps of a ritual? So I wrote this book, The Witch's Guide to Creating and Performing Rituals, to go deeper into that and what it actually takes and some of the nuance of creating ritual that isn't obvious if you've never created any rituals in the past. And I wanted to call this book The Witch's Guide to Creating and Performing Rituals That Don't Suck, but Llewellyn didn't like that. So they changed it to That Actually Work. But in my mind, that's still the title, creating rituals that don't suck.
Yeah, I love that. But I also love that, it seems like there's a lot of books that come out recently that have really long titles like that.
Yes,
and it just makes me think of all of this 18th and 19th century books that the title was the whole frontispiece of the book. So.
I know. It's for someone who owns a metaphysical shop. I'm like, really? This is a long title for me to put into my system.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't know. I love this idea of giving people a framework.
Yeah.
Because I do think a lot, especially if you kind of look at, the books that are already out, the slew of books that we get every year about kind of 101, it's it's almost like a recipe book, just insert your name here kind of stuff with rituals. And I love the idea of giving people a framework and kind of talking through the different aspects of it. Because I do think, especially if you're coming new to witchcraft and you want to kind of take control of that, you're coming from possibly a culture of mainstream religion that has very rigid liturgy. Yeah. And so you kind of got to unlearn that or take from it what is valuable and then come to this new place. So I like the idea of giving people that blueprint.
And I am mainly a practitioner in the reclaiming tradition of witchcraft, which is a sister to the fairy tradition of witchcraft, right? So in the reclaiming system, no ritual is the same. The creation, the setup, the creating of sacred space, that process is kind of the same, but every ritual is different. So if you go to a reclaiming public ritual, which, happen all over the place, you're unlikely to attend the same ritual twice. And so that is where my training as a priestess happened, is in this system where every ritual we're creating something from scratch. We're starting over. We're doing something completely new. And there's a lot of ecstatic practice in the reclaiming tradition. And, I've dabbled a lot, and I feel like of all the traditions I've dabbled in and all of the different initiations I've been through, the reclaiming tradition of witchcraft really knows how to raise energy and have that ecstatic moment. So this book is greatly influenced by my training as a priestess or a priestess in that tradition, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, since I haven't gotten to look at it yet.
Yeah.
What do you feel like is something that you really want readers to take away from that book specifically? Once they've digested this, what do you hope they kind of go on to do with it from there?
It's really it can give you a formula of how to create ritual, but I think the most important thing, and I would say this every day, every minute to every practitioner if I could, is to allow space for things to unfold and not be so rigid. If you have a plan and things aren't going according to plan, that's okay. When you make a mistake, that's okay. The world is not going to crash down around you if you set the chant wrong or you forgot the candle or whatever. You've got to make mistakes. Mistakes are so important to our practices, and you've got to go with the flow. If you I can't even tell you how many times I've been so rigidly attached to something going a certain way, and then it went a different way and was way better than I could ever have imagined. Mm-hmm. We have to leave room for mystery and the spirits and for things to unfold, and that can't be controlled by humans. Yeah. So letting go a little, leaving room for mystery.
Well, and I think it's just good to remember that the universe nor the gods, however you look at it, expect humans to be perfect at anything.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I always say it's a spiritual practice, not a spiritual perfect.
Right.
We're not meant to be perfect.
Yeah. And I mean, even if things do go chaotically wrong, hopefully it's a good story later.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah. Yeah,
you'll be
like
able
when I
to
burned my
reminisce on the
hair,
badness.
my elevation ritual, I leaned over the candle and a huge chunk of my hair went flying off into the room. And thank gosh my high priestess was paying attention, or I would have lost more of my hair in that ritual. These things are going to happen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the number of stories I've heard from practitioners of all sorts that involve their hair catching on fire.
I know. It's a serious vocational hazard.
Like, we like long flowy hair and we don't like to tie it back when there are candles. It's like we should have learned at
I
some point.
know.
Maybe braids.
No.
Maybe braids are the answer.
Then you just lose the whole braid.
Well, that's true too. Yeah. Then it's like a wig for your hair. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh. So I don't know if you want to talk about this, but I'll ask it. We can always edit it out if you don't want to talk about it. But I had Storm Fairwolf on last season and we talked about witches' names. And so I'm just curious how you came to yours, because I'm going to assume, perhaps wrongly, that is not what your parents named you.
No, it's not. No, I'm happy to talk about that. Yeah, my name, the name given to me at birth, it had never felt like it belonged to me ever. And my mom loves the name she gave me. And my whole life I've been like, well, then you take that name. Like, even when I was a kid, I was like, well, if you love it so much, then you take that name. Like, it's never felt like me. And my family, they don't call me Phoenix. My parents, my mom's okay. My dad's a little bit more of a stickler. He refuses to call me Phoenix, but I do have a nickname of my birth name, and they all call me that nickname. They never called me my full name. And my nickname, and I'll just tell you what it is. So my birth name is Danielle. I don't feel like a Danielle at all.
Yeah, I would not have associated you with Danielle.
No, I don't like it. I don't like the way it sounds. I don't like the way it feels. It's like that itchy, fuzzy sweater we were talking about. Most of the people in my life that were close to me called me Danny. And that's okay. It doesn't make me want to throw up or anything, but it still didn't feel like me. And then in high school, actually, I went to a alternative high school for dropouts, or kids who were in danger of being dropouts. And the name of the school was Phoenix. And it was after the bird, not the city.
Yeah.
And honestly, I wouldn't be who I am if I hadn't gone to that school. It was a major transformational time for me. I stepped into my personal power. I started practicing witchcraft before I went into this school, but it allowed me to blossom. They let me teach the whole class about witchcraft. I got to do a lecture.
Awesome.
I started writing more in this environment. Like, I stepped into leadership. I just really figured out who I was. And then a long time later, probably 10 years later, I was with a coven, 2 other women. There was 3 of us in this coven, and we decided we were going to spend a year figuring out what we wanted to be called. And so we went through this process together, and at the end, we did a naming ceremony and a ritual, and Phoenix was just the name that really stuck. It always felt right when I put it on. It feels like who I am and home. But the Phoenix LaFae actually was like, oh, that's perfect. Like, that is exactly who I am. That's exactly who I feel like. That is the perfect thing. So since that ritual, I started introducing myself as Phoenix. All of my bills come to Phoenix. It's not on my driver's license, but because it costs a lot of money to change your name in the state of California.
Yeah.
But everyone in my life knows me as Phoenix, and that is the name the name that feels like me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like that. So when you started publishing, you just knew that was the name on the spine. That was the right thing. Yeah.
Yeah. There's no question about it. Yeah.
No, I like that. I love that story. I love the idea of spending a whole year on that process too.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that,
when I was like a teenager and reading all the books about Wicca in the 90s, there was a lot of like how to find your spiritual name and how to find your witch name and doing numerology and numerological alphabets and all that stuff. And I spent years probably playing with those ideas and concepts and trying to like logicalize it. And it's not a logical process. It's a total emotional process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember very early, like in the first group I practiced with, we were supposed to all choose names because there was a little bit of secrecy around it. I mean, it was the 90s and still
Yeah.
satanic panic stuff.
Yeah.
And I just had a horrible time. And I came up with this name like on the fly one night that I used for years in witchcraft circles. And now like it just feels like an itchy sweater. Like it was a bad choice, but it worked at the time, but I'm done with it kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Well, when I was pregnant with my daughter, there were two names that kept coming to me. And at one point I realized one of the names was mine. It was like my pregnancy name. And no one ever called me by that name except for myself. But I really felt like during this moment of transition, this is who I am. I'm not Danny. I'm not Phoenix. I'm this other name. And then when she was born, it was so obvious to me that the other name was hers. And so, names change, they come and go. We don't have to stick with any names. Storm's book is great. He talks about that in his book. It's a fluid thing. It doesn't have to stick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. I'm just always fascinated with the names people choose for themselves because I mean, sometimes like I feel like my name that my parents gave me, it fits. Like it took me a little while to grow into it, but when I did, I was like, oh no, this is my name. But but then sometimes like you said, people just are named things and they're like, this is not who I am. And how do you go about that process of finding out what it is? I'm sorry that it's so expensive for people to change it for trans people and for people who are just like, this isn't my name.
I know, it's ridiculous. Yeah.
It's a process and a journey, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I kind of like to ask folks, and sometimes it comes up on its own and sometimes it doesn't, but kind of what you said about sitting with things and letting things come on their own.
Yeah.
Like I think one of the things that gets in my way as a practitioner is my skepticism.
Oh yeah.
And so like, is that something that you deal with as well? It's like, oh yeah, this feels weird and this can't be real kind of stuff.
Oh yeah. In my heart, I am a skeptic. 100%. And, I go to one of the things that Reclaiming does is put on witch camps. So there's witch camps that happen all over the world. And I've been attending California witch camp since 2009, I think. And it's 7 days long, ritual and workshop and community. And there is at least one moment every year. And I've been going since 2009. I still have this moment where I look around and I'm like, all these people are nuts. How did I get myself into this situation? What the hell? This is crazy. I think that's normal and healthy, right? Like we need to hear that skeptical voice. When something weird happens, my first reaction is to find a logical explanation because weird is scary. And so having a logical explanation makes it a little less scary. But guess what? The world is freaking scary. Weird things happen all the time, and we don't have to understand them or give them logical explanations. And, I tell my students all the time, does this make you feel weird? Does this make you feel awkward? Is this embarrassing? Great. Keep going. Like say your spells out loud. Don't just think it in your head. Is it awkward to say this rhyming chant out loud? Does it make you feel weird? Yes. Good. Keep going, So I think that it's a balance of hearing the skepticism and then still allowing the world to be weird. Mm-hmm. I think it's healthy.
Yeah, I haven't thought about it in the terms of the world being weird, but that totally resonates and makes me think of just how easily we normalize the weird sometimes to not process it.
Yeah.
Like our planet is a weird place.
Yeah.
Just like, and then like on top of all of that other, the stuff that humans do that we normalize that we shouldn't. So
yeah. No, and bodies are weird. Our bodies do weird and totally things we don't understand still, quote unquote, scientifically. And when I say weird, I mean weird, like WEIRD, and I mean weird, like WYRD, that like metaphysical, expansive, we just don't know. Like those two words really do fit together in my brain. And it's just like having a moment to enjoy that and experience it. And my partner right now is reading a book about fungi and mushrooms, and he keeps telling me all this weird, crazy stuff about like the mushroom networks and mycelium and all. It's so amazing. And it doesn't necessarily make logical sense in my brain. And I love it. Like, that's great. Let's have more of that.
Dipping into mushrooms is like you're on mushrooms. I mean, it is totally. That world is so completely bizarre.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. So what are you reading right now?
I am reading The Triumph of the Moon by Professor Hutton. Mm-hmm. I decided last year to start reading some of the older, like classic occult books that I tried to read when I was 15 and gave up on because the language was too old fashioned. And now that I have more perspective and experience, the language isn't as hard for me to digest. So like I read a bunch of Aleister Crowley and Gerald Gardner and Doreen Valiente last year. So now I'm reading a very academic book. And it's great. It's so good, but it's thick and academic. So I do struggle with that language. But I'm also reading the Book of Night by Holly Black because I love fantasy and fairies and alternative realms. So those are the two books I'm working through at the moment.
I know. I'd love to have like a fiction and a nonfiction going at the same time that you can kind of dip in and out of. I am bad about having multiple books going at the same time. Partly because of the podcast, because I'm always reading something for the podcast, but then try to read stuff for myself too. But it's So what made you decide? I mean, what was the real impetus to go back and read like the hardcore stuff?
It's the older I get and the more I am involved in the witchcraft community and the occult community, the more I want to understand the origins and the truth, right? Like I was definitely a Margaret Murrayite in the 90s where once upon a time it was a goddess culture and we were matriarchal. And I was like, yes, this is the truth and I am all for it. And now I know that is not based on good scientific process. And it's unlikely that a lot of what she wrote about that goddess movement was true. And as much as that sucks, I'm glad to know the truth rather than a fantasy. So that's why I started going back. I read Levi and I've read some of like Arthur Waite's very boring writings. And I just feel like I want to know where these folks learned what they learned, so I can sort of unpack what I've been taught and find some threads of like, because, the reality is everything we believe and practice in the witchcraft world was made up by somebody. Who cares? Like it was all made up by somebody. I'm just curious who.
Yeah.
So I'm starting to dig through some of these older journals and notes and grimoires to try and figure out like, this person stole maybe from this other writer and this writer was influenced by this writer and how fascinating. And it's turned into this. Wow. Amazing. So it's my journey to discover more origins, I guess.
Yeah. No, I mean, I've kind of been in a similar place just because I feel like one, I want to kind of examine like you said, like, where did this stuff come from? And that somehow people think if it's made up, it's not as valuable. And I'm like, humans have made up everything. That's how it works.
Exactly.
So, that part doesn't bother me. The part is like, where did they get it?
Yeah.
And why?
Yeah.
And if they stole it from someone, is it maybe something that we should unpack about that? And maybe like, that's not a good thing that we continue to do this.
Yeah.
So I think it's been a real journey because I feel like, I came to witchcraft in the late 80s, early 90s and kind of through new age stuff, which is even more problematic in some ways, like just what they borrowed from.
Right.
So it's been a journey of,
right.
Out of those moments of
really
like, that's where that's from. Yeah.
Yeah. It's fascinating. And I also think like, wow, this dude wrote about this in the 1700s and modern witchcraft is still using that practice.
Mm-hmm.
How freaking amazing. Like that, how did it survived in quiet corners this long? Like the practice of witchcraft as we know it probably wasn't whispered from woman to woman over the centuries. That's probably unrealistic, but these magical concepts were handed over through really scholars and, wealthy white people in Western Europe, which is, only one way of looking at the magical world. There's lots of other ways.
Yeah.
But it is fascinating what stuck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I am intrigued by that, like the braiding of like that tradition, like the Western esoteric tradition and like cunning folk and folk medicine and folklore and how all those things. And we arrive at, modern day.
Yeah.
witchcraft practices.
Yeah. See, I could nerd out about this for hours. We could totally nerd out about all of this stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's why I have a podcast. Is to nerd out about writing and books and all of that. But that totally makes sense to me. So do you think that's changing how you write, reading this, going back to the well, I guess, in a way?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I joke about this in the classes that I teach because I feel like as my mind is changing and I'm learning more, like I want to share that with other people. And sometimes it feels like I'm destroying people's, fantasy beliefs or the thing that they've believed in. Like every time I talk about the origins of the threefold law, there's always someone I can watch their heart break while I'm talking about it. So, but it is changing the way I look at things because I don't care if it was made up yesterday, but I want to know that it was made up yesterday. Mm-hmm. And I want to share with other people that it was made up yesterday. So I'm trying to be a lot more transparent about that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I think it's important to acknowledge where these things come from and what was stolen from cultures that shouldn't have been stolen. And, we need to be honest about those things.
Yeah. And I think for me, as I've gotten older, I mean, I turned 50 last year. So like, I'm kind of
nice. Congratulations.
Thank you. I know there were a lot of times in my 20s, I wasn't sure that was going to happen. So it felt really good. But, I feel like, yes, I want to know it was made up yesterday and I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
But the thing that I've come to like my witchcraft as I get older is I still do things. I still have a practice, but part of it is also wisdom and knowing. Like that's become a big part of it. And that piece of going back and where did this come from? And what is the lineage of this practice? Like that to me is like, I hate to say stepping into my elderhood, but maybe that's part of what's going on. So,
right. Yeah. I mean, I think at first, especially in the 80s and the 90s, our community needed to legitimize our practices, and therefore it had to be older. Mm-hmm. Older equaled better. And that's just not the case anymore. And we know better now. And older doesn't necessarily mean better. Does it work? That's what matters, mm-hmm. So, and it's an evolving thing. Witchcraft, esoteric practices, the occult, it evolves. It doesn't stay static, and it's going to be influenced by the culture that it exists in. And, so I find all of those things fascinating. And I think the more we understand it, the better practitioners we become.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I think if anyone still like has this doubt about, is it real? It's like, well, their entire academic dissertations and departments and researchers who are looking at the phenomenon of it. So the phenomenon is real. Like there's no way around that part of it. Whether or not it was made up yesterday, 50 years ago, something that someone came up with in the 1600s, it's real. It impacts people's lives. Yep. We build our reality, and it's part of the reality we've built.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. No, I love that. Oh, so I guess like, is there something about your new book you want to talk about specifically? I just feel like because I didn't get to read it, that I don't have like a question to come up with that or talk about that work specifically. So I want to make sure to give you space to kind of expound on that.
It's hard because, the other weird thing, because now that I've written a few books and I am not good with doing publicity, like I'm always like, oh yeah, I wrote this book, because I don't know, I feel so awkward about talking about I did this thing. I wrote this book a year ago. So I must like, right, what did I write in that book?
Like you've already scented it out of your brain for what's next.
Right. Yeah, there's only so much room in there. I think one of the things that I talk about in this book, and we've kind of touched on these topics already, I call them the 3 keys of witchcraft. And it is, the 3 keys are knowing thyself, discernment, and bravery. And I feel like if you are connected or working on those 3 concepts, then you have the keys. You are doing the thing. You are on the right path. And you'll be able to create rituals or perform spells or even just be a better human if those 3 things are you're actively working on. And I think that's part of any good and healthy spiritual practice. And that concept has sort of evolved over the last 5 or 6 years, these sort of 3 keys that I think are the most important. And it's totally radically changed the way that I practice and the way that I look at how I'm doing, because sometimes I'm like, oh yeah, it's a full moon. I should be doing something. It's like I should be doing something, but I am. I'm working on myself. I am working on understanding my triggers and the things that fire me up. I am working on taking the next step and pushing my edges and pushing my boundaries to grow and evolve as a human being. And I don't think we give some of those practices enough credit. Like, we need to do the full moon ritual. We need to do the Sabbath. We need to, do our meditative practice. And there's just so much more to it than those things, those outward things that can be viewed. So I think that's a big part. It's a tiny part of the book talking about the 3 P's of witchcraft, but it is like the way of unlocking the book is understanding those concepts.
Yeah. Well, and I like the idea of making it more intentional in that way too, because I do think it would be very easy to say, okay, I must do this full moon ritual. I must do this thing on the Sabbath. I must do Monday. And it become rote and not have meaning behind it.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I'm a witch because I did something on the full moon.
Right.
I brush my teeth every day. That doesn't make me a dentist.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And there's, a lot of Catholics will only go to church on Easter and on Christmas, and like, where is the line drawn that makes you that quote unquote good spiritual practitioner, whatever your religious background may be, and it's more than showing up for the holiday. There's more to it than that.
Yeah, I think so too. And I don't know. I mean, you bring this up in the Witches, Heretics, and Warrior Women book about, we had this idea that witchcraft is basically becomes self-care, like this idea that you're just always doing something for your own personal needs and wants. And I'm like, I don't agree with you in what you say in the book that is transformative work to do that. And I think the definition of self-care has become, like you said, this idea of like rose petal bubble baths and stuff. Yeah. That's not really self-care. That is self-care. It can be self-care, but that's not really where the concept comes from.
Right.
Of self-care.
Right.
And self-care is radical.
Yeah. Pampering and self-care have become like the same, and they're not, right? Like
I always sometimes it's like the boring self-care. Like the boring self-care is where self-care really happens. It's like that to me, and that's not sexy, and you can't take an Instagram picture of it.
No, but it is important to your practice. Like, I have a generalized anxiety disorder. I take meds for that. Right. I do it every freaking day because that is self-care. It keeps me from spinning out. It keeps me from not being able to function in my life. That is self-care. Drinking water, eating food, bathing, like these things that when you have a depression, anxiety, any kind of mental illness, and that is impossible for you to get out of bed and bathe, finding a way to do it is self-care, right? Like that's not Instagrammable. You're right. It's not sexy. It's not pretty. It is getting through and being as healthy as you can in that moment, whatever that looks like. Yeah. It's hard sometimes.
It is hard. And I feel like the progression of that is once I am able to do those things, if I'm caring for myself, I can care for my family and the people I care about, and I can care for things happening in the world. But if that first step doesn't happen, none of the other stuff happens.
Right.
Or it happens and you burn out and blow yourself up. I mean,
you know what? Burnout is so important to talk about for our communities, and we don't talk about it enough, because when you are supporting a community, especially if you are working with people and you're not a solitary practitioner, like it's a whole different ball of wax when you're a solitary practitioner. But when you're working for community, you give a lot. It's not just like being in a shiny role in a public ritual. It's like schlepping altar materials and listening to someone who's having a hard time in their life and being available and having meetings and potlucks. And it's a lot of freaking work, and you can burn out real fast. And one of my mentors told me, you won't know you're burnt out until you're way past the point of burnout. Mm-hmm. And then you'll be like, oh, so it's a dangerous thing that we do to ourselves in our witchcraft communities, because we are small communities and we get bonded and tight really fast because we do such intimate and powerful things together. And it's something that we really do have to pay attention to, because that is a part of self-care, is not letting yourself get to a point of burnout. It is so easy to do.
Yeah. And I do think it's something, I mean, I think it's a way that we can learn to care for each other too
Yeah.
in community. Because one of the things that happens, and this happens in any small community, like, I mean, I was a practicing Unitarian Universalist for years.
Yeah.
And that also happens in that community because it's a
Yep.
small community. Is once you do the thing, then you're the person that people know can do the thing.
That's right.
You're like, then you're the go-to person. And it's like, I did the thing this one time, but it's really not something I enjoyed and I don't want to do it again. But then it's hard to say no because then you're like, who's going to do it?
Yep. Yeah, the who's going to do it question is what keeps people trapped doing things that they don't want to do, but they love their community and they know it needs to happen.
Right.
You know, and sometimes you have to leave that vacuum and allow the space to fill, or you have to leave that vacuum and allow it to fall apart. You know, like it's your health and well-being is just as vital to the health and well-being as the community as you giving every ounce of yourself for the well-being of the community.
Yeah. Sacrifice doesn't always mean putting yourself on the altar.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah. It's such a complicated thing. And I mean, I think it is writ large, like you said, in witchcraft communities because they are so small and tight knit. But like it happens in, you know, people's offices. I mean, it's such a universal thing. And I do think that people who often step into that role, women and femmes and queer people who often step into those roles because they've learned to be caregivers or they've had to be caregivers, tend to get sucked into that a little easier. I mean, I know men who fall into that trap too. I mean, I'm not saying men don't also do it, but the majority of women I know have already been in that position.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, so maybe there's a book idea there for you. It's like a bigger book project there. So it's like, how do we deal with burnout and witchcraft?
Right.
If it's not you, maybe somebody listening will be like, yes.
Yeah, so we definitely need help with that.
That's the next book we need. Yeah. Oh, well, before we get to our game of chance at the end, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about what's coming up for you. This will probably air in the spring.
Okay.
So think about timing that way and where people can get in touch with you. And then we'll make sure all that's in the show notes too, but so people can get it in their ear as well. Yeah.
Let's see. So I hope to be presenting at Mystic South this year. I think I haven't heard back officially yet, but I'm hoping that comes to manifest. I am part of the teaching team for California Witch Camp this summer. So if you want to go to a week-long intensive in Northern California, it's a 7-day amazing experience. And we're working with the goddess Bridget this year. So she's one of my ladies. I'm very excited for that. And that's kind of all I have fully organized right now is through July.
That's pretty good. I mean, you're half a year in if you're organized through July. So
yeah. But I have phoenixlefae.com. I'm always posting what's going on there. And Phoenix LaFae is my handle on all the things on Instagram and Twitter. And I'm not really on Facebook anymore. But you can find me in the other places. And I always, try to keep posting what's going on and where you can find me on my website. Yeah.
Great. All right. So let's get to our game of chance question. Okay. So depending on the die, I'm going to roll a die. And depending on what I roll, you'll get a question about death, sex, religion, politics, or money. And if I roll a 6, you get to pick which one you want.
Okay.
So 5, money. Oh, I'm always fascinated. You don't want money?
No, I'm excited. I love talking about money. Okay.
So I feel like as someone who has a business, this is also a really good topic. So I think that there is still, I think it's less frequent, but I still think it happens that there's this idea that if it's spiritual or witchcraft, it should be free.
Yeah.
And we all know that people can't eat your goodwill.
Yeah, free. No.
So how do you deal with that when those topics come up as someone who, as a writer, also has to get paid and someone running a witchy business? How do you cope with that?
Yeah, I love talking about money. I am a Taurus. So, that it is a way that I look at the world is through security and stability. And you're right. The truth is, you can't eat goodwill. You can't eat best wishes. We do live in a society built around capitalism. Does capitalism suck? 100%, but it's the system that we're in. So I encourage folks who are, more anarchists, which are a lot of the people in the reclaiming tradition. I encourage those people, yes, let's dismantle patriarchy. Let's dismantle this bullshit structure, but we also have to survive while we're still in it. And ultimately, money is just a different energy, like literally, especially now where you can go on a computer and move zeros from one place to another. You don't actually touch anything or feel anything. It's all in this magical ether. It's just energy. It doesn't really mean anything. And if we have a good relationship with that energy, we're going to feel a lot better about where we are and how to get more of it and how to deal with it. And so much about wealth and having enough is reciprocity. Giving, having a good relationship with that cycle of reciprocity and making sure you help others and you're doing the best that you can to give when you receive is so important. But also, when you come to me as I read tarot cards professionally, I do spells for people professionally. I have experience. I have almost this month, actually, 30 years of experience doing this work. You're paying me for that experience. I am asking for you to compensate me for my background and experience. I'm happy to tell you how to do it yourself. I'm happy to show you the ropes and get you to where you need to be so you can do it yourself. But if you want access to my experience, I need to be compensated for that. And I always offer scholarship or something for the classes that I teach for access to my experience, because I never want money to be a reason someone doesn't explore. But ultimately, you have to be willing to put, your skin in the game. And most often that comes in the form of money and finances.
No, I agree. And I think, with writing and with witchcraft and all of that, like everybody says you get more conservative as you get older. It's like, I think I'm becoming an anarchist as I get older. Like, I always consider myself a democratic socialist, and now I'm like, maybe I'm actually an anarchist. but you're right. It's like, we have to dismantle the system, but you can't starve to death. And you also can't. I mean, I was listening to a podcast recently with Margaret Killjoy, who I interviewed earlier in an earlier episode. And she said, we can't romanticize poverty. Yeah. Which I think is real easy to do. And in witchcraft and in anarchism, this idea that the struggle, there's beauty in the struggle. There is beauty in the struggle. There's not beauty in starvation.
No.
So,
and there's nothing wrong with wanting to be comfortable. Right. There's nothing wrong with wanting to not be in debt. There's nothing wrong with wanting to have a good education. Like all of these, there's nothing wrong with these things. And these things require money. That is the system that we are in. And I'm not a fan of the system, but I know how to play the game. And so I will play the game. Because even if we dismantled capitalism tomorrow, then what? Like, people have been bartering and trading since the beginning of time. I have this thing, you have that thing. Let's trade so we both have some of both things, right? Like, we just used money as the thing right now. Mm-hmm. We're going to have something to replace capitalism. Yeah. So in the meantime, let's work with what we've got. Let's dismantle it brick by brick. And let's work within the system and make it work for us. It's proven that the more queers and femmes and women that have money, the more good they do with that money. They give it to causes. They help the poor. They help shelters. They provide for animals. And we are the communities that have been kept from wealth for the longest time. So now it's time for us women and queers and femmes to step forward and take some of that capital and do good shit with it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I have this like nascent theory that I've been rolling around for the past few months about, like you said, money is an energy, and capitalism, to me, more so than this idea of like I think people say when you want to dismantle capitalism, you're like, oh, you don't want people to, get compensated for what they do. And I was like, that's not really, to me, in capitalism, the definition that I've started working with is capitalism is the fetishization of hoarding capital and 100%. Money. That's what it is.
Yes.
So in order to dismantle that, then it is back to those socialist kind of things, it is this redistribution of who has power in the system and who can do things. So if, and the energy of money as this like egregore is something that wants to move around. It doesn't want to sit in a bank account somewhere. With a bunch of zeros in Zurich or wherever. So like, let's figure that part out. And I am all for, if someone said, I really want your book, but I can't afford it, but I have a dozen eggs. Hell, right now I would take the dozen eggs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hands down. No question. Give me the dozen eggs.
Yep.
So
yeah, we do a lot of events. We vend at a lot of events, and every time there'll be another vendor who's like, hey, I want this thing. I have this thing. Can we trade? I always will go for the trade. Always. I've traded massage treatments for workshops. I've traded healing ointments for workshops. Like, I'm always down to trade. I'm always down for that because it's an exchange. I'm giving you something and I want to be compensated for what I'm offering. Like, that's just fair.
Yeah.
And I'll take that compensation. I like money. I'm happy to take money as the form of compensation. But if that's not what you've got right now, we'll figure something else out. Right. Like,
And I think that also builds community, because then I think it's like, if you make that trade and you're like, oh, this person did this great thing, I'm going to tell other people about it, whether I paid for it with cash or paid for it with something else I had.
Yeah.
Like, you're also like, then it becomes this, again, it's an exchange in a bigger way too. Yeah. So, and honestly, I've said this on the podcast before, but it was part of the reason I wanted to do the podcast, because I was tired of paying for ads for my books and things that I didn't feel like made any sense to me. And I was like, what is the thing I want? And it's like, well, I want to sell more books, but I also want other people to sell more books that I also want to read.
Yeah.
So podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that concept of when the water rises, all the boats rise, right?
Exactly.
Like, the more we support the community in general, the more it serves us. But when we're coming from a place of serving community, it lifts us all up rather than just me. And I think you're right about capitalism. It's the fetishization of hoarding, 100%. And when you are elbowing people out of the way to get that, golden nugget, that is the wrong approach. If we are working together to get that golden nugget, it's going to go a lot further and help a lot more people. And like I said, those of us that have been kept down by the systems, we desire more to help communities and help people because we see how much that helps.
Yeah. It helps everybody. If you look at like the worst problems we have, moving to California, like I worked in healthcare for the homeless before in my nonprofit world life. And, moving to California where the homeless problem, people without houses is a big issue here. And it's like, if we would actually address the actual problem, it wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah.
So, yeah. What is I can't remember the source, but I saw it somewhere on social media. Someone was said, we're not ready to talk about the fact that we don't have a housing problem. We have a greed problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that it's a uniquely like Western issue. Obviously it's an issue all over the world, but it's a uniquely Western issue of hoarding to the point that you couldn't actually use all the resources that you have in your lifetime and still seeking
lifetimes.
More. Yeah. It's so bizarre to me. It's so bizarre. Yeah.
Well, they should just put us in charge. I don't want to be in charge, but like clearly, but I do think that people who have different ideas need to be in charge. I feel like we've been doing the same thing for too long.
We have. I do feel hope for the future, though, with the young folks that are stepping up into politics and leadership right now. Like it feels like good things are coming.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's really easy to be disillusioned to the point of despair right now, and I don't blame anybody who's there. Like I don't blame you at all. But I also at my core want to be hopeful, and so I am trying to see those things as hopeful too. So
yeah.
Just because I'm a Scorpio doesn't mean I actually want to live in a cave. So,
right.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Phoenix, thank you so much for being on the show. This is I feel like, could talk about these things for hours and hours.
Totally. I love that.
And we could just do like a 4-part podcast, but we'll let people get back to their day. But thank you.
Thank you. It's been fun chatting with you.
WitchLit is a production of Thousandfold Press. Our intro music is Cosmic Glow by Andrew Kay, and our outro music is Voices by Alexander Shanekar. Transcripts and all our previous episodes are available at witchlitpod.com, and you can follow us on Instagram at witchlitpod. Thanks for listening and for reading witchy.